Imagine a time when theological arguments weren't just, quiet academic debates tucked away somewhere. Imagine them as high stakes political crises, crises that could literally land you on a scaffold. That's the electrifying world we're diving into today. We're plunging deep into the crucible of Calvinism to explore the Canons of Dort. Specifically, we're focusing on the third and fourth main points of doctrine. Now, you might know these doctrines, maybe, as the T and I of that famous TULIP acronym, but trust me, you're about to discover a story that's far richer, much more dramatic, and really deeply foundational than just a simple mnemonic device.
Right. And what's truly striking here, I think, is how documents like the Canons of Dort are never just abstract theological treatises created in a vacuum. They just aren't. These are texts forged in a crucible of national identity and, frankly, profound conflict. They were responding to a living, breathing challenge, a challenge that genuinely threatened to tear a young nation apart. So our mission today is to understand not just what these doctrines say about human nature and divine grace, but why they mattered so profoundly back then, and importantly, how they continue to shape religious thought even today. They really stand as a testament to the sheer power of ideas, how ideas can shape human history and national destinies.
That's a critical insight. Absolutely. And as we explore this deep dive, you might just find some, profound insights into where different Christian traditions draw their lines on free will and grace. Insights that could maybe offer you a new lens for understanding the religious landscape today. It's still relevant. We're going to uncover the volatile 17th century Dutch context where this all played out. It was intense. We'll look at the significant theological challenge posed by Jacobus Arminius and his followers, then the powerful, really definitive international response of the Synod of Dort. And then we'll meticulously unpack the detailed arguments, about human corruption and divine conversion. Our sources for this deep dive, they include rich historical accounts, incisive theological analyses, and even direct excerpts from the canons themselves. So we're offering you a direct path to being truly well-informed on this complex and honestly foundational topic. Okay, so the story of Dort isn't simply a theological tale, not at all. It's intrinsically woven into the very fabric of a nation that was quite literally fighting for its life. To truly understand the canons, we first need to understand the Netherlands of the early 17th century. This wasn't just any nation, it was the newly formed Dutch Republic, brand new. And they were fresh off the brutal 80 Years' War, a grueling, bloody struggle for independence from the Catholic superpower of Spain. Now, this war wasn't merely about political freedom, though that was huge. It was equally, maybe even more so, about defining a distinct Protestant religious identity for this fledgling nation. Who were they going to be? The Synod of Dort itself actually convened during a fragile period. It was known as the 12 Years' Truce, from 1609 to 1621. You'd think a truce would bring peace, right? But instead, this pause in the external conflict only heightened the internal tensions. Massively. It transformed the nation into this simmering cauldron of unrest beneath a really deceptive veneer of calm.
Yeah, and it's absolutely crucial to grasp that the concept of a separation between church and state, well, as we understand it and often idealize it today, it was completely alien in this era. It's not how they thought. In the 17th century, theological disputes were never purely academic. Never. They carried immediate, severe, and often violent political ramifications. The controversy surrounding Jacobus Arminius, which we'll definitely delve into shortly, it wasn't some isolated doctrinal squabble happening in a university hall. It quickly became deeply entangled with existing political factions. It exacerbated class struggles, particularly between the influential, often more liberal merchant classes and the, let's say, more conservative pastoral classes. And at its core, it became a fundamental debate over who held the ultimate power. Was it the civil magistrates who tended to lean towards state control over the church? Or was it the church itself which championed its autonomy, especially in matters of doctrine? And this wasn't minor bickering. I mean, the conflict escalated to the point where the nation stood on the very brink of civil war. You had armed militias forming for opposing sides, literally prepared to defend their theological and political allegiances with force. It was that serious.
Wow, that level of intensity really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? So for the Orthodox Calvinists, they were often called counter-remonstrants. Arminianism wasn't just a theological disagreement. It was seen as something much more dangerous. They perceived it as a dangerous theological softening, a kind of doctrinal weakness, and they feared it could, in their eyes, lead to compromise with Catholic powers like Spain, the very nation they'd fought so hard to escape and against whom they had defined their new republic. This perception elevated Arminianism, for some, from merely, unsound doctrine to outright political treason.
Exactly, treason.
The defense of Reformed orthodoxy was thus inextricably linked to the preservation of national security and the very identity of the Dutch Republic. Catholic. It was fundamental. Their theological precision, their sometimes uncompromising stance, it was, in part, driven by this perceived existential threat to their hard-won nation. It truly was about more than just doctrine. It was about the soul and, frankly, the very survival of the Netherlands.
And this historical context, it raises a really important question for us even today, doesn't it? How often do we see theological or ideological debates become so deeply intertwined with national identity, where dissent gets perceived as disloyalty? We might think we're past such things in our modern, more secularized world.
Yeah.
But perhaps the intensity of our current cultural and political divides shows us that this human tendency, this linking of our deepest beliefs with our collective identity, it's far more enduring than we might comfortably imagine.
We certainly do see echoes of it, yeah. And if you want a stark, really chilling example of this fusion of theological and political stakes, look no further than the arrest and execution of the leading Arminian sympathizing statesman Johann van Oldenbarneveld. This happened on charges of treason in May 1619, mere days after the Synod of Dort had concluded its deliberations. Days.
Not a coincidence.
Not at all. This event powerfully illustrates that the Canons of Dort must be read as more than just a theological statement. They were a declaration of theological independence, a bulwark against what was seen as a corrosive, destabilizing influence, an influence threatening to unravel the hard-won Reformation in the Netherlands. They were essentially a line drawn in the sand, both doctrinally and politically, and it had profound, sometimes deadly consequences. So who was the man at the epicenter of this storm? The theological catalyst for such profound national crisis. His name was Jacobus Arminius. He was a highly respected professor of theology at the University of Leiden. Born in 1560, passed away in 1609. During his time there, Arminius began to question some of the established Reformed doctrines, particularly those articulated in the Church's foundational confessional standards, the Belgic Confession from 1561 and the Heidelberg Catechism from 1563. These were essentially the constitutional documents outlining the Dutch Reformed faith, you could say.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
And his teachings specifically challenged the prevailing understanding of predestination, grace, and free will, which were, cornerstones of Reformed theology at the time. Now, his questioning didn't go unnoticed. And after Arminius' death in 1609, his followers, who became known as the Remonstrants, they formalized his views. In 1610, they presented this pivotal document to the States General of the Netherlands. It was a kind of theological petition, really. It was titled The 5 Articles of Remonstrance. And this document wasn't just some theological memo. It became the direct impetus, the direct reason for convening the Synod of Dort. It clearly defined the terms of the entire debate and really set the stage for the intense confrontation that followed.
Absolutely. This document truly represents a clear theological pivot, a shift. And understanding its points is absolutely key to grasping the entire controversy. It really is. So let's break down what the Remonstrants actually argued for. These points were the direct challenge the Synod of Dort was convened to answer. Okay, first, they proposed conditional election. What this meant was that God's election to salvation, his choice of who would be saved, was conditioned upon his foreknowledge. His foreknowledge of who would freely choose to believe and persevere in faith. The crucial insight here, you see, is that it essentially placed human choice right at the forefront of the divine decision-making process for salvation. God's choice became responsive to man's predicted choice.
Okay, so God looks ahead, sees who will choose faith, and then elects them based on that foreseen faith.
Basically, yes. That's the core idea of conditional election. Second, they held to unlimited atonement. This doctrine asserted that Christ's death on the cross was, in principle, for all humanity, universally available to everyone. However, its saving benefit, its efficacy, was only applied to those who actually believe. So it maintained the necessity of faith, definitely, but broadened the potential scope of the atonement itself. Christ died for all, potentially, but it only works for believers.
Got it. Died for all, saves believers.
Third, the Remonstrants taught partial depravity. Now, this is a big one. While they readily acknowledged that humanity is indeed affected by the fall and absolutely requires grace to be saved, they didn't go as far as the Orthodox Calvinists. They argue that humanity is not so totally depraved as to be unable to exercise free will, at least to some degree. In their view, the human will retained an inherent capacity to cooperate with God's grace. It wasn't utterly enslaved to sin, they argued, just weakened, able to initiate a response if prompted by grace.
So wounded but not dead, capable of reaching out for the lifeline, perhaps.
That's a fair analogy, yes. Wounded, needing help, but capable of accepting it through an act of will. Fourth, They championed irresistible grace. This point posited that the grace of the Holy Spirit, the grace that draws a sinner to Christ and enables belief, can indeed be resisted. It can be rejected by the human will. It wasn't seen as an irresistible force that overwhelms the will. A person could decisively say no to God's saving initiative. This made human consent the ultimate determinant in whether grace was effective or not.
So God offers, but we have the final veto power.
Essentially, yes. The final decision rests with the individual's will. And finally, their fifth point was conditional preservation. This argued that it is possible for true believers, people who genuinely had faith to, through their own will and actions, fall away from grace and ultimately lose their salvation. Salvation, therefore, wasn't eternally secured by God alone in their view. It was dependent on ongoing human faithfulness and perseverance. You had to hold on.
Wow. Okay, so the core takeaway from these 5 points, it seems pretty clear. They fundamentally challenged a central tenet that defined the Reformation itself. The understanding of salvation by grace alone, sola gratia.
Exactly.
By introducing human will as a decisive factor in election, in the application of atonement, in the ability to cooperate with grace, in the capacity to resist it, and even in the potential to lose salvation. The Remonstrants were seen by many Orthodox Calvinists as profoundly undermining the absolute sovereignty of God in salvation, and critically, reintroducing a significant element of, well, human merit or ability back into the equation.
And that raises a truly important question for us, doesn't it? What does it truly mean for salvation to be by grace alone if human will still plays such a decisive ultimate role? A role in accepting or rejecting that grace, or even in maintaining it. That was the central tension, the very heart of the conflict. And that's what the Synod of Dort had to directly address. They saw this as a fundamental reevaluation of divine initiative versus human capacity. And it had profound implications for how one understood both God and humanity.
So, faced with this escalating crisis, which, as we discussed, really threatened to tear the Dutch Republic apart, the Dutch States General took action. They convened a national synod in the bustling city of Dordrecht, or Dort, as it's commonly known. Now, this wasn't just some local church meeting, not at all. It had significant international character. We're talking about 27 foreign delegates representing Reformed churches from Great Britain, Germany, and Switzerland. Though, interestingly, French delegates were actually blocked from attending by their own king. Politics again, you see.
Always intertwined.
Right. But this international presence was absolutely crucial because it lent the synod's decisions a weight far beyond a merely national council. It established them as an ecumenical consensus, a unified voice, really, for the entire Reformed world at that time. Its authority resonated across borders, intending to solidify Reformed theology across the continent.
And what's truly illuminating here is the precise scope and purpose of the Synod. You really need to get this. It wasn't tasked with creating a brand new, comprehensive confession of faith from scratch. That wasn't the goal. Instead, its purpose was specific and judicial, to thoroughly examine and officially rule upon those 5 points of the Remonstrance, point by point. So the resulting document, the Canons of Dort, is therefore limited in scope. It functions as a detailed explanation and defense of Reformed soteriology. That's the doctrine of salvation. And it's specifically and polemically, meaning argumentatively, in direct response to that Arminian challenge. It's best understood not as a totally new confession, but as an extended clarification, a precise delineation of doctrines already present in the earlier Belgic confession. It was a reaffirmation and a sharpening of existing beliefs, not a major innovation.
That distinction is incredibly important.
Yeah.
And the structure of the canons themselves directly reflects this very purpose. You can see it laid out. They are organized into 5 heads of doctrine, and each one directly corresponds to one of the 5 articles presented by the Remonstrants. It's a direct answer. Within each head, you'll find a positive exposition of the Reformed doctrine, basically, what they do believe and why. And that's followed by a formal rejection of errors, which outlines precisely what they don't believe and why the Arminian positions were deemed erroneous, even dangerous.
Very clear lines being drawn.
Absolutely. And it's within this polemical, high-stakes context that the 3rd and 4th main points of doctrine, the combined focus of our deep dive today, must be analyzed. Because these 2 sections directly address the critical, interconnected issues of human corruption and divine conversion. They lay the groundwork for the entire Reformed understanding of how salvation actually happens. Okay. To truly understand the Synod's response, we need to begin where they began. And that's with a stark, really unsparing diagnosis of the human condition after the fall. Remember that crucible of national identity we talked about? How theology could be seen as treason?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, for the Synod, resolving that existential crisis meant laying bare the most fundamental issue. What is humanity truly capable of? What's our actual state? And their answer, which begins in these third and fourth main points, delivered a diagnosis so comprehensive. Well, it would leave no doubt in their minds about the absolute necessity of divine intervention. This section is all about systematically establishing humanity's profound corruption, establishing it as the necessary prerequisite for a doctrine of salvation based entirely on God's sovereign grace. The Synod's argument here, it methodically dismantles any basis for human autonomy or contribution in salvation. It makes divine intervention not just helpful, but absolutely essential, the only hope left. So, we start with Article 1. This establishes the foundational baseline, original creation and the catastrophic fall. The canons affirm that humanity was originally created in the image of God, possessing perfect and positive spiritual gifts. We're talking about true and saving knowledge of his creator, righteousness in his will and heart, and purity in all his affections. This was a state of holistic holiness, where every part of the human person, mind, will, emotions was perfectly aligned with God. Beautiful.
A perfect state.
But then came the fall, and it's described not as some minor misstep, not an oops moment, but as a catastrophic rebellion. At the instigation of the devil, yes, but crucially, through their own free will. That detail is important. The first humans deliberately disobeyed God, and in doing so, they forfeited these divine gifts, lost them. The consequences were devastating, comprehensive, corrupting every single faculty of human nature. Instead of that original holiness, humanity brought upon itself blindness, terrible darkness, vanity, and perverseness of judgment in their mind, malice, rebellion, and hardness in their will and heart, and impurity in all his affections.
Wow, there's quite a list.
It is. This initial article powerfully establishes the depth of the problem, a total pervasive corruption of the entire human person, right from the start.
What's truly illuminating here, building on that, is the universality of this corruption. Article 2 then addresses this in detail through the doctrine of original sin. The canons explicitly reject the idea, which some held back then, and maybe some still do, that sin spreads merely by imitation. Like Adam set a bad example, and we just copy him.
Right, like it's just learned behavior.
Exactly. They saw that as far too superficial. It misses the inherited nature of the problem. Instead, they affirm the classical doctrine of original sin, an inherited condition of sinfulness affecting all humanity right from conception. The text states that after the fall, man begat children of the same nature with himself. Unquote, this goes, produces like. And this corruption has, quote, extended from Adam to all his descendants by the propagation of a perverted nature. It's passed down. Rooted in passages like Romans 5.12:19, this means that all people, with the sole exception of Christ, of course enter the world not as blank slates, not neutral, but as children of wrath, already bearing a sinful nature inclined toward evil and already under divine condemnation. This inherited state is the grim foundation upon which all the subsequent articles are built. It establishes humanity's starting point as one of profound spiritual disadvantage, a starting point where we are already morally compromised from the get-go.
Okay, this inherited state, as Article 2 starkly shows, really does put humanity at a profound spiritual disadvantage right from birth. But the real question, the one that sparked the fiercest debate and truly cuts to the quick, is, what does that actually mean for our will, our ability to choose? Can we, even with a little help, choose God? Or desire God? That's precisely what Article 3 confronts head-on. This is the heart of what's often called total depravity. Now, it's crucial, really crucial, to understand what this does not mean first, because it's often misunderstood.
Very often, yes.
It does not mean that fallen humans are as evil as they could possibly be in their outward actions, or that they're incapable of civic good, common virtues, or acts of kindness within human society. We still see acts of compassion, self-sacrifice, moral uprightness in the world, don't we? Often for noble earthly causes.
Of course, common grace allows for that.
Right. But what it does mean, according to the canons, and this is the crucial insight, is that total refers to the extent of sin's corruption, not necessarily its intensity in every action. Sin has affected and corrupted every single part of human nature, mind, will, emotions, even the body. The entire person is spiritually dead in their sins and slaves to sin. That's the language they use. Dead slaves.
Very strong language.
Very. And the critical implication here is this. Quote, without the grace of the regenerating Holy Spirit, they are neither willing nor able to return to God, to reform their distorted nature, or even to dispose themselves to such reform. They can't even prepare themselves for it. This directly refutes the Arminian position, which argued the human will, though weakened, retains some freedom, some residual capacity to cooperate with grace.
The wounded but still functioning will idea?
Exactly. The canons argued the will is not merely sick or injured, it's in profound spiritual bondage. It's actively hostile to God and totally incapable of initiating spiritual recovery or even preparing itself for that recovery on its own. It's a profound declaration of utter spiritual helplessness, a will that is simply unable to desire God for God's sake or choose him freely.
Yeah, and this stark diagnosis then leads naturally to considering Article 4, which examines the insufficiency of natural means, specifically what they call the light of nature. This raises an important question, doesn't it? If we're so utterly depraved, do we have any knowledge of God at all outside of the Bible or special revelation? The Synod acknowledges, yes, there's a remnant of divine knowledge, light of nature. This refers to general revelation, what we can perceive through creation and our own conscience.
Like seeing the stars and thinking there must be a creator, or feeling guilt.
Exactly, that sort of thing. Drawn from passages like Romans 1.1920 and 2.1415, it provides all people with some notion of God's existence, his power, and a basic moral law. It gives humanity a sense of the divine, a feeling of accountability. However, and this is the key point, the canons are emphatically clear that this light is far from being sufficient to bring him to a saving knowledge of God and to true conversion. It can't save you. Instead of leading to salvation, fallen humanity actually pollutes it in various ways and holds it in unrighteousness. We suppress that knowledge. This makes us inexcusable before God, yes, but utterly unable to save ourselves through this natural knowledge alone. It's enough to convict us of our need for God, tragically, but not enough to actually redeem us.
Right. And what's true of the light of nature is also true of the law, which Article 5 addresses next. For the Synod, it was crucial to also establish that even God's revealed law, the commandments given through Moses, couldn't save humanity either. The Mosaic Law, embodied in the Ten Commandments and other statutes, serves a vital purpose, they acknowledge. It discovers the greatness of sin and more convinces man thereof. It shows us just how sinful we are.
It's like a perfect mirror.
Exactly. A perfect diagnostic tool, a precise mirror, laying bare the full malignancy of the disease of sin. It shows us exactly where we fall short of God's perfect, righteous standard. However, and here's the rub, the law itself offers no remedy. It provides no power to escape from misery. Weakened by the flesh, as Paul says, the law can only leave the transgressor under its curse. It condemns us without offering a way out. It reveals the standard but imparts absolutely no ability to meet it. It acts as that mirror, showing our spiritual brokenness, but it doesn't offer the medicine nor the strength to take it. So when you look at it, the logical progression of these 5 articles is really a masterclass in theological argument. It's tightly reasoned.
It really is. Very systematic.
The Synod systematically eliminates every potential ground for human contribution to salvation, every escape route, you might say. It establishes the profound and pervasive nature of sin in Articles 1 and 2, defines its consequence as a complete spiritual immutability in Article 3, and then refutes any appeal to salvation through either innate human reason in Article 4 or a concerted moral effort through the law in Article 5. This creates a theological cul-de-sac, a dead end, leaving you with the inescapable conclusion, if any hope for salvation exists, it must originate entirely from a source outside of fallen humanity. It can't come from within us.
That's the crux of it.
This methodical demolition of human ability isn't just a doctrinal assertion. It's a deliberate rhetorical strategy designed to make God's sovereign grace appear not just plausible, but absolutely necessary, the only possible solution left standing. Okay, so having established humanity's utter inability to save itself, that bleak diagnosis, this deep dive now pivots dramatically. We move to the positive construction of salvation. How does it happen then? This second section, running from Articles 6 through 17, details conversion as a thoroughly supernatural and sovereign work of God, from beginning to end. The central argument is decidedly monergistic. That's a key term, meaning a work of God alone. One worker, God.
Mono-orgon.
One work. Exactly. Explicitly opposing the Arminian synergistic model synergoi, working together the cooperative model. Regeneration, the new birth, is emphatically defined here as the divine cause, not the human consequence, of saving faith.
That reversal is critical.
Absolutely. It's a crucial foundational distinction that really changes everything about how you understand salvation.
Yeah, and this section begins by affirming that what the light of nature and the law are powerless to accomplish, God achieves. He achieves it through the Holy Spirit, using a specific means, the word or ministry of reconciliation, which is basically the gospel of the Messiah. This gospel, proclaimed and heard, is God's exclusive means to save believers. But this immediately raises an important question, a question the Synod meticulously sought to answer. If God is so sovereign and if election is unconditional, does that make the public offer of the gospel somehow disingenuous, like a sort of cruel trick played on those not elected?
That's a common objection, isn't it, if God already knows who will be saved?
It is. And Article 8 addresses this directly. It states that all who are called through the gospel are called earnestly, or sincerely. That's the word used, sincere. God earnestly and most truly shows in his word what is pleasing to him, namely, that he who is called should come to him. The promise of rest and eternal life is genuinely offered to all who come and believe, no exceptions in the offer. This establishes a crucial distinction between the universal, sincere external call of the gospel, which goes out broadly to all who hear it, and the particular effective internal call of the Spirit, which infallibly brings the elect, and only the elect, to faith. So the external call is genuine for all, but only the internal call effectively transforms the heart and guarantees a positive response.
Okay, that's a fascinating and really important clarification for the integrity of the gospel call. Makes sense. And here's where it gets truly compelling, I think, as the canons carefully balance human responsibility and divine sovereignty. They hold both together. They address the twofold response to the gospel call. Some accept, some reject. Why? Article 9 focuses squarely on human culpability. In alignment with, say, Jesus' parable of the sower, the blame for rejecting the gospel falls squarely on the sitter's shoulders. It's their fault. The fault is not in the gospel, nor in Christ offered therein, nor in God who calls by the gospel, but in those who are called.
Responsibility lies with the rejecter.
Exactly. Unbelief is the result of human sin. Whether it manifests as proud self-assurance, shallow emotionalism, or maybe the choking cares of the world, humans are thus fully responsible for their rejection of the sincere gospel offer. They face just condemnation for their unwillingness to believe. Conversely, Article 10 then emphasizes divine agency. Why does anyone accept? The reason anyone does accept the gospel and converts is attributed solely and exclusively to God. Period. It is not to be ascribed to the proper exercise of free will, but it must be wholly ascribed to God.
No room for human boasting there.
None. God, in accordance with his eternal decree of election, effectually calls them, confers upon them faith and repentance, and delivering them from the power of darkness, translates them into the kingdom of his Son. This article directly refutes the core Pelagian and Arminian error, as the Synod saw it. The error that a person's faith is the distinguishing factor that sets them apart from others, that they made the difference. For the canons, the distinguishing factor is God's sovereign grace alone, not a human decision or inherent merit.
Right. And Articles 11 through 13 then provide the theological engine for the canon's doctrine of conversion. This is the powerhouse, the supernatural work of regeneration or the new birth. And this isn't just a gentle nudge, or a helping hand. It's described as an astonishing, almost ineffable transformation. Article 11 describes the process. God does far more than just present the gospel externally or sort of illuminate the mind intellectually. Through the efficacious working of the same regenerating Spirit, God penetrates into the inmost man. He opens the closed and softens the hard heart and circumcises that which was uncircumcised. Powerful imagery.
Very internal, very deep.
Absolutely. And most crucially, he infuses new qualities into the will, making that which was dead alive, that which was evil good, that which was unwilling willing, and that which was stubborn obedient. This is not an act of mere assistance or persuasion. It's a profound, internal, complete transformation of the will itself. Then Article 12 emphasizes the nature of this work. Regeneration is described in the most powerful terms possible. It is a supernatural, most powerful, and at the same time most delightful, astonishing, mysterious, and ineffable work. They heap up the adjectives, and they say it's in no wise inferior in efficacy to creation or the resurrection from the dead. Think about that. As powerful as creating the universe or raising someone from the dead.
That's incredible power, not just suggestion.
Exactly. It is not accomplished by moral persuasion, which was closer to the Arminian view,
Right.
but is a direct divine operation performed in the sinner without our aid. And the result, all in whom God works this way are certainly, infallibly, and effectually regenerated and do actually believe. It works every time. And Article 13 concludes this section by acknowledging that while the effects of regeneration are clearly known and experienced by believers, the precise manner of this operation, how God actually does it, is a divine mystery. We can't fully comprehend it in this life. Now, what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how the canons fundamentally reorder the process of salvation. The ordo salutis, as theologians call it. For Arminians, it was typically understood as something like God offers enabling grace, man then exercises faith, and then as a result, man is regenerated or born again. Faith comes first.
Right, faith triggers regeneration.
Yes. But the canons decisively reverse this causal chain. It's a profound statement. They assert, God sovereignly regenerates the sinner's heart and will first. This new spiritual life then enables the sinner to exercise faith, gives them the ability and the desire, and consequently the sinner believes. This isn't a minor theological adjustment. It's a fundamental shift in the locus of salvation, moving it from a cooperative human divine enterprise to a sovereign divine accomplishment. Regeneration is the cause, not the consequence, of saving faith. This is the linchpin of their entire soteriological system, ensuring that salvation is wholly, entirely of God.
Okay, so what does this all mean for faith itself, for the act of believing? If regeneration comes first, Article 14 clarifies that faith is unequivocally a gift of God, that famous phrase from Ephesians 2. It's not merely that God offers the gift of salvation for man to accept by his own power of faith, nor is it that God only provides the ability to believe, leaving the act of believing entirely to human choice.
A subtle but important distinction.
Very, rather God, who works in man both to will and to do, as Philippians says. He produces both the will to believe and the act of belief itself. Faith is actually conferred, breathed, and infused into him. That's the language, infused. It is the certain fruit of regeneration, not the contingent root of it, ensuring that even our belief, our turning to God, is ultimately from him. And Article 15 reinforces this by stating quite starkly that God owes this grace to no one. Nobody deserves it. And those who receive it should offer eternal thanks, pure gratitude, while those who do not receive it are left to their own choices and have no basis to complain against God because he owes no one saving grace.
It underscores the gratuitous, the completely unmerited nature of saving grace, given freely and sovereignly, not based on anything in us. And the final two articles in this section then address potential misunderstandings of this powerful doctrine, particularly regarding human will. People might think this makes us robots.
Right, the stocks and blocks objection.
Exactly. Article 16 clarifies that regeneration does not violate or destroy the human will. It doesn't treat people as inanimate stocks and blocks as if we were puppets without any real choice or volition. Instead, the work of grace spiritually revives, heals, corrects, and at the same time sweetly and powerfully bends the will. It redirects it. Where carnal rebellion and hostility to God once dominated, a ready and sincere spiritual obedience now prevails. The desire changes. This, the canons assert, is the true and spiritual restoration and freedom of our will. True freedom, they argue, isn't being able to choose contrary to God, but being freed from sin to willingly choose God.
So freedom is liberation to obey, not freedom from influence.
Precisely. Liberation from the bondage of sin that prevents us from choosing God. It enables genuine, uncoerced spiritual freedom aligned with God's nature. And finally, Article 17 affirms that God's sovereign and supernatural work does not negate the crucial use of means. This is important pastorally. Just as God uses means in the natural world, rain, sun, soil, to accomplish his purposes, he uses means in the spiritual realm. The gospel, preached and heard, is explicitly called the seed of regeneration and the food of the soul. Vital tools. Therefore, the church has a solemn duty to preach the word, administer the sacraments, and exercise church discipline. These are not optional extras. Grace is normally conferred through these means, through these admonitions. And the more faithfully the church performs its duties, the synod implies, the more God's grace is displayed and glorified. But the glory for both the means and their saving fruit belongs to God alone. It never shifts back to human effort.
That's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That divine sovereignty and human responsibility, when rightly understood, are complementary. They work together in God's grand design, not against each other. Okay, so having built up this detailed, positive understanding of human corruption and divine conversion, the canons then turned to a crucial part of their judicial task. They weren't just explaining, they were judging. Following the positive exposition of doctrine, the canons conclude the third and fourth main points with a formal rejection of the errors. This section is explicitly polemical, it's argumentative, aims squarely at refuting opposing views. It draws sharp, unambiguous lines around what they considered reformed orthodoxy. No fuzzy edges here.
Definitely not. They wanted clarity.
It consists of 9 paragraphs, and each one targets a specific Arminian tenet or what the synod considered to be its underlying Pelagian leanings. Pelagianism being the ultimate heresy of self-salvation in their eyes. By examining precisely what was condemned, what they rejected, we gain the clearest possible insight into the controversy's precise nature and the core issues at stake for the synod.
Right. And these rejections function as a systematic, point-by-point dismantling of the Arminian system, particularly its view of human ability and cooperative grace. The first 4 rejections, concerning human nature, are absolutely foundational. They get right to the root. They condemn any teaching that minimizes the guilt in condemning power or original sin, that's error 1. They condemn any teaching that posits spiritual gifts like holiness were not part of man's original will and thus weren't really lost in the fall. Error 2. They condemn claims that the will itself wasn't corrupted, but only hindered or obstructed by the fall. Error 3. And they condemn any suggestion that the unregenerate person still possesses the capacity to hunger and thirst after righteousness, or offer a sacrifice pleasing to God on their own initiative. Error 4.
So basically reinforcing that total inability from every angle.
Exactly. These rejections collectively uphold the doctrine of total inability, clearly opposing the Remonstrants' view of a partial depravity that left the will wounded, but still free enough to cooperate. For the Synod, any remaining capacity in the unregenerate human will for initiating spiritual good after the fall was deemed a dangerous illusion.
Okay, then the fifth rejection, error V, targets the idea that a corrupt person can properly use what the Remonstrants called common grace, or the light of nature, to gradually work their way towards attaining saving grace.
The idea that you can sort of build on common grace to get to saving grace?
Right. This directly refuted a key component of synergistic systems, which often posit some kind of universal enabling grace that makes salvation possible for all, but it's contingent on a proper human response. The Synod, in contrast, argued that Scripture and experience prove the opposite. They said God sovereignly distributes the means of grace as he pleases, and that common grace, while real, simply does not lead to saving grace. It's insufficient for genuine spiritual transformation on its own. Now here's where it gets truly profound, I think. The final four rejections, errors the 6 through 9. These address the nature of saving grace itself and cut right to the very heart of the Arminian system. The Synod condemned teaching that faith is merely a human act, enabled by grace maybe, but still fundamentally a human act, and not a divinely infused gift. Error 6.
The distinction again, act versus gift.
Crucial. They condemn the idea that saving grace is nothing more than gentle persuasion or moral suasion, errors 7. They saw this as basically Pelagianism, just convincing the intellect, not changing the heart's core disposition. They condemn the idea that God's regenerating grace can be successfully resisted by the human will. Error 8. This would render God's saving power ultimately subservient to human choice.
Making man sovereign over God in salvation, essentially.
That's how they saw it. And finally, they condemn the idea that grace and free will are concurrent, partial causes in conversion, with the human will somehow having to make the first move, even a tiny one, to initiate the process. Error 9. These articles directly attack the very core of the Arminian system, a synergistic conversion process built upon irresistible grace and the decisive power of human choice. A system that, in the Synod's view, placed the ultimate authority for salvation squarely and dangerously in humanity's hands.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here is the Synod's ultimate diagnosis of the Remonstrant position. Where did they see this all leading? They saw the Arminian scheme not as just a minor variation within the Reformed family, not just a slightly different emphasis, but as a fundamental departure from the core Reformation principle of sola gratia, grace alone. And critically, they saw it as a revival of an ancient heresy, semi-Pelagianism.
Okay, can you quickly unpack those terms, Pelagianism, semi-Pelagianism?
Just briefly, full Pelagianism, in its most extreme form, taught salvation could be achieved purely by human effort, without any need for divine grace at all, just good enough. Semi-Pelagianism, which was condemned way back at the Council of Orange in 529 AD, was more subtle, is trickier. It held that while divine grace was indeed necessary for salvation eventually, the initial step of faith, the very first movement toward God, originated from the unaided human will. Man takes the first step, then God helps.
Okay. So grace helps but doesn't initiate.
Exactly. And the Synod identified this same logical structure, the same basic pattern in the Arminian system. By insisting on a will that could cooperate with or resist grace, and by making faith the human condition that triggers regeneration, the Remonstrants had, in the Synod's firm view, made the autonomous human will the ultimate arbiter of salvation. They had effectively given man the final say in his own spiritual destiny. So the rejection of errors therefore frames the debate not merely as an internal reform dispute, but as a crucial defense of Augustinian and Reformation orthodoxy against the doctrine the historic church had long ago condemned as subtly undermining God's sovereignty and the necessity of his initiating grace.
Okay, so what's the clearest takeaway then from this deep dive for understanding the core debate, the absolute bottom line? To really bring it into focus, let's just quickly summarize the fundamental opposing positions again, based on our sources on these key doctrines. You can see how clearly the lines were drawn. On the human condition. Arminian view. Partially depraved, the will is weakened, yes, but still retains freedom to cooperate with enabling grace. Reformed position affirmed by Dort, totally unable. The will is in bondage to sin, spiritually dead, inherently averse to God, cannot initiate.
Big difference there.
Huge. Regarding the initiation of salvation, Arminian view. Synergistic. Human will cooperates with God's enabling grace, often called prevenient grace, making the decisive choice a partnership. Reformed view. Monergistic. God's regenerating grace sovereignly precedes and infallibly enables faith. Wholly nuslibi. His work beginning to end. On the nature of grace. Arminian view. Resistible. Grace is like a gentle persuasion that can be accepted or rejected by human free will. Reformed view. Irresistible, or maybe better term, efficacious. Grace is powerful, unfailingly accomplishing salvation in the elect. It doesn't just make salvation possible, it actually brings it about.
It achieves its purpose.
Right. And finally, the role of faith. Arminian view. Faith is a human condition for regeneration, an act of the will enabled by grace maybe, but ultimately performed by man. Reformed view. Faith is a divine gift. It's the fruit and evidence of a prior regeneration, supernaturally infused by the Holy Spirit. Regeneration causes faith.
The order matters immensely.
It really does. These antitheses clearly define the lines drawn at Dort and highlight the profound, often irreconcilable differences in how these two major traditions understand salvation itself. So these third and fourth main points of doctrine from the Canons of Dort, they represent a truly monumental landmark in Protestant theology, no doubt about it. They provide a definitive, detailed, and enduring articulation of the Reformed understanding of sin and grace. And their influence continues to reverberate, shaping the beliefs and practices of millions of believers, even centuries later. Now, let's turn our attention to that popular connection you might already know, TULIP.
Ah, yes, the famous acronym.
Right. In popular understanding, Dort is almost synonymous with TULIP, which summarizes the 5 points of Calvinism. But here's a fun fact, a bit of trivia you might not know. TULIP is actually a much later pedagogical device. A teaching tool. It likely originated in the early 20th century, created simply to help summarize the synod's ruling in an easy-to-remember way.
It wasn't used in the synod itself.
Not at all. The canons themselves don't follow that TULIP order. As we saw, they actually correspond more closely to ULTIP, or maybe LUTIP, depending on how you group them.
Because they followed the remonstrance order. Conditional election, rejected as unconditional election. Unlimited atonement, rejected as limited atonement. Then depravity, grace, perseverance.
Exactly. They responded point by point to the 5 articles of remonstrance. But despite the different order, the third and fourth main points of doctrine our focus today directly correspond to 2 of TULIP's points. And they're absolutely central to its framework. The T for total depravity. That's a direct summary of the doctrine of total inability as articulated back in Articles 1 to 5. Those articles define the fallen human condition as one of comprehensive corruption and spiritual death, rendering individuals utterly unable and unwilling to save themselves. That's the T. And the I for irresistible grace. Well, that corresponds directly to the doctrine of efficacious grace and regeneration, which we explored in Articles 10-17. Those articles describe a divine grace that is not merely persuasive, but powerful, supernatural, and unfailing in its application. It infallibly brings the elect to saving faith. That's the I.
Check again.
So while the acronym TULIP came much later, the deep theological heart it represents, particularly the T and the I, was indeed forged right there in the crucible of Dort.
And, contrary to common caricatures, and there are many, that these doctrines are cold, speculative, maybe even fatalistic. What's truly compelling here when you read the canons themselves is their deeply pastoral purpose. That often gets missed.
How so? Pastoral?
Well, they aim to ground a believer's assurance of salvation firmly, robustly, in the objective work and unchanging character of God, rather than grounding it in the subjective, often wavering, performance of the human will. Think about it. The doctrine of total inability is intended to produce profound humility, to strip away all self-reliance and force the sinner to look entirely outside themselves for any hope of salvation. That's pastoral, leading to dependence on God.
Okay, I see that. Humility, dependence.
And correspondingly, the doctrine of irresistible grace, or efficacious grace, is intended to provide profound comfort and security, real assurance. If conversion is truly a supernatural work of God, as powerful and certain as creation itself, as they said, then the believer's salvation is not ultimately contingent on our fickle ability to hold on to God, but rather on God's omnipotent power to hold on to us.
That does sound more secure.
Right. This focus on God's sovereign initiative was seen by the Synod as the only true basis for lasting assurance, offering a deep peace that relying on human effort or subjective feelings could never truly provide. That's deeply pastoral.
Absolutely. And more than 4 centuries later, the Canons of Dort remain a vital and incredibly influential document. They haven't just gathered dust. They form part of what's known as the three forms of unity that's alongside the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism. And these three documents together are official confessional standards for many Reformed and Presbyterian denominations globally, particularly those with strong Dutch roots, like the Christian Reformed Church in North America, CRCNA, the Reformed Church in America, RCA, the Protestant Reformed Churches, PRCA, and numerous other Reformed bodies across the globe. They still subscribe to these canons. So what does this all mean for you today, listening to this? Well, the theological fault lines drawn at Dort continue to define primary soteriological divisions over the doctrine of salvation within Protestantism. They haven't gone away.
Still very much present.
The debate between the monergism of the canons, salvation is God's work alone, and the synergism of the remonstrance, salvation is a cooperative effort, marks the essential difference between Calvinist and Arminian traditions. This distinction is still vibrantly evident today in the theological divergence between denominations in the Reformed Presbyterian family on one side, and those in, say, the Methodist Wesleyan and many Pentecostal families on the other, which largely follow an Arminian framework, emphasizing free will and resistible grace. The arguments from the 17th century are still very much alive, shaping the theological landscape of global Christianity and influencing how millions understand their faith and how salvation works.
And this raises an important question, I think, for modern believers to ponder. Because many core tenets of Arminianism, things like salvation, depending ultimately on a free will decision, the concept of resistible grace, a strong focus on human cooperation, these ideas have become widespread. They're even mainstream beliefs within broad swaths of modern evangelicalism, sometimes without people even knowing the historical labels.
Yeah, it often feels like the default assumption for many.
It does. And because of that, the Canons of Dort have actually gained renewed relevance in recent years. For those seeking to understand and perhaps defend a historically reformed perspective on salvation, the canons offer a precise counter-narrative. They provide a robust theological framework for understanding God's sovereign, singular role in bringing humanity to salvation. And they challenge assumptions about free will and grace that are now deeply ingrained in popular religious thought, prompting deeper reflection on sola gratia. #Tactatra.
Wow, what a journey we've undertaken today. That was a deep dive indeed. We've peeled back the layers of the Canons of Dort, revealing not just complex theological doctrines, which they certainly are, but also a powerful story of national identity, intense intellectual struggle, and profound conviction. Lives were on the line. You've now seen how the third and fourth main points form the anthropological and soteriological heart of this historic document, presenting an unsparing assessment of human sinfulness and an exalted, utterly sovereign view of God's saving grace.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the canons decisively rejected the synergistic model of the remonstrance. They drew a clear line, and they solidified a monergistic understanding of salvation for the Reformed tradition. God alone saves. They stand today as a precise, eloquent, and enduring defense of the Reformation's central claim, that salvation from beginning to end is by grace alone, sola gratia, and therefore, ultimately, it's to the glory of God alone, soli Deo gloria. That was the ultimate goal.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider this provocative thought. If the Canons of Dort assert that true spiritual freedom comes not from the power to choose independently of God, or even contrary to God, but rather from the human will being supernaturally restored by God to willingly choose him, how might that profound perspective reshape your understanding of freedom itself? Not just in theology, but maybe in every aspect of your life and the choices you make. What does true freedom really look like? Something to think about.